Sorry?
Did we have a spill or something?
Yeah,
What happened?
just some water.
Oh.
Yeah.
Morning, Roger.
Hello, sir. So, looks like we'll just get started in a few minutes
Okay, sounds good.
for a couple more people to come in.
Mm-hmm.
All right, why don't we get started? So first of all, thank you so much for everyone who's joined us today. We truly appreciate you taking the time out. We hope this is going to add some value to you and your companies. So it's going to be a 45-minute presentation. Hopefully there's some Q&A at the end though. And throughout the 45 minutes, what we're going to talk about is what is a branded podcast, 10 reasons why your brand should be podcasting, how your brand can podcast, what type of brand is right for podcasting, some factors to consider when podcasting. We then have a special offer for those that stick around to the end. And of course, if anybody has any questions, please just leave them in the Q&A box included in the Zoom window. So first of all, we are Jar Audio. And Jar Audio helps companies grow their revenue through ROI-driven podcasts that make meaningful connections between listeners and brands. My name is Roger Nairn. I'm the CEO of Jar Audio. I come from 18 years in the advertising world, working with big brands like Four Seasons, Netflix, Lamborghini. Really get excited about brands that have amazing stories to tell.
Thanks, Roger. And I'm Paul Stewart. I'm Director of Outreach for Jar Audio. I've been in business development for about 25 years. I started in media and entertainment in the 90s, mostly film, TV, and technology, and then moved into the environmental movement, particularly climate change and carbon offsets in the knots. And then for the last almost decade, been focusing on media again and technology.
So why should you listen to us? First of all, Jar Audio is one of the first companies to produce podcasts with brands. And we've been lucky enough to work with some amazing brands, including Lululemon, Expedia, Cineplex, and Van City. We also have a lot of really exciting shows that are in production as we speak. We can't exactly announce them yet, but some really cool, amazing brands. We also work with nonprofits, different organizations, as well as some sort of mid-tier business as well. At the end of the day, though, we get really excited about working with winning podcast strategies and executions, which is why we want to get started on this presentation. So first of all, I wanted to start off with some definitions. Now, some of you might know all these things already, but we just want to make sure. When we talk about what a podcast is, a podcast typically involves an episodic series. It's spoken word, it is audio, and it is delivered in digital fashion. What's great about podcasting is the niche topics that we focus on. It could be entertainment, talking about something that's comedic or maybe a drama. Could be news or education. There's really no end to the possibilities when it comes to the types of niche topics that you can talk about and explore. The format though is shifting. It used to be that podcasts were delivered just through mobile. Now we see a lot of desktop use, especially during the pandemic, as well as smart speakers. It used to be audio only, but now we're seeing a blend of audio and video. Joe Rogan's a perfect example of that, where you see the recording of the episodes themselves and pushed through YouTube. And then, traditionally, when you downloaded a podcast, the file would literally be added to your device. But now we're seeing more streaming environments, Spotify being a perfect example. It also used to be that podcasting where it was entirely free, but we are seeing some business models that involve gated podcasts where you're paying a subscription fee. Specifically though, what is a branded podcast? Well, a branded podcast is essentially everything that I just mentioned, only it's owned and produced by the brand itself. Typically an episode would have a very thoughtful mention of the brand, but isn't necessarily screaming the brand the entire show, because who wants to listen to a 30-minute ad, right? The topic is tangential to the brand. So if you're Nike, for example, you could talk about different training elements that different athletes are going through. Or if you're a Blue Apron, they've done an amazing show about why we eat what we eat and the types of food that we're consuming. At the end of the day, though, it has to deliver a ton of value to the listener. And some ways of doing that is to either be entertaining, to be helpful, or to be educational. These are just an example of some of the brands that have embraced podcasting. More of the disruptor brands like Tesla, but even some of the more traditional brands like General Electric. What is a podcast, or what is a branded podcast not though? It's not advertising on a brand. That's obviously an option. You can put an advertisement on other podcasts, but this is not what we're talking about. It's also not rotated sponsorship of the podcast. You might listen to an episode that is brought to you by Blue Apron, but then next week it's brought to you by Casper mattresses, or next week it's brought to you by MailChimp. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is the brand becoming a broadcaster in and of itself. They own the show. It's their property, and therefore the brand becomes a broadcaster. Another way of looking at it is content marketing. Podcasts have become the new darling of the content marketing world. And at the end of the day, this is about branded entertainment. And this isn't exactly new. I mean, this is stuff that we were doing decades and decades ago. The Michelin Guide that we know today was originally a pamphlet put out by the Michelin Tire Company to entice people to travel across Europe, but is now known as the world's leader in the best cuisine in the world. We're all familiar with the soap operas. Well, that originally started as a Procter & Gamble initiative, which then turned into the soap operas that we know today. And Ronald Reagan and the General Electric Theater was one of the first ways that we were entertained on television. Podcasts like The Message, which is a podcast put out by General Electric, is a perfect example. What the show is not is it has nothing to do with General Electric's medical devices or aircraft parts. What it is, though, is a fictional sci-fi series about messages received from space. Super entertaining. Rami Malek is the lead in it. It's absolutely fantastic. But it's not about aircraft parts and medical devices. It does, however, have a brand halo around it, which the show is all about invention and innovation, and so they're getting that brand halo effect. Another example is a show that Jar Audio produced for Expedia, called Out Travel the System. And the idea behind it is that it's not about promoting Expedia deals and hotel discounts and things like that. But what it is a really high value show that gives travelers a sneak peek behind the curtain, arming them with insider tips, tricks, and hacks for how to get the best out of their travel. And again, Expedia has that brand halo effect. They're a service-built organization and are leveraging their data and travel expertise to provide as much value to the listener as possible. Some really important things when it comes to a branded podcast, it should rarely mention the brand. We're not saying not to mention it at all, but throughout the show, we should not be talking about, oh, isn't this, this is why you should choose our product because we're talking about this. It's actually not about that at all. And if it is about that, the listener will turn it off. The show itself also should, generally not run advertisements from other brands. Mostly because the listener has a little bit of skepticism going into it, and so to add more marketing messages on top can backfire. But the more important thing to remember is that it has to deliver a ton of value. Because it is coming from a brand, it has to deliver a ton of value. So why are brands embracing podcasts? Paul's going to take it off from here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Roger. So we've boiled it down to the top 10 reasons. And reason number one really is that podcast audiences are exploding, or they continue to explode. I definitely want to point your attention to Edison Research's Infinite Dial report. This one is for USA 2020. There's also one for Canada, I believe South Africa, and a few other countries. You'll notice here that this statistic they're pointing to in this graph is monthly podcast listeners. You can see the growth that we've seen over the last number of years, approaching 40% or over 104 million listeners in the United States. Next slide. You can also see just the age demographic broken down. So it used to be considered more of a young person's medium, but you can see how particularly recently, the numbers for age 55 plus are definitely skewing upwards as well. We should mention that we do cover Canada and the United States, and we do see similar listenership in both countries. Canada and the US both lead the world in terms of podcast listenership. And it's definitely, as a result, been embraced by many media groups and brand studios, right? Vox, Bloomberg, New York Times, probably one of the most famous cases. As a matter of fact, in conversation with Adam over at T Brand Studio, he has suggested that in the next 3 years, all major brands will have a podcast. Number two, podcasts allow you to reach new audiences. So let's take a look at the typical podcast listener. They're educated, 45% more likely to have a college degree. Affluent, 45% more likely to have household income of $250,000. They're loyal to brands. 46% of the youngest cohort are okay with brands promoting products. And 51% of biweekly listeners have made purchases based on hearing podcast ads. They spend more money on themselves. They're more likely to drink bottled water, juice beer, those sorts of things. Next slide. They also love to learn. I think curiosity is one of the most interesting aspects of listening to podcasts. 74% of users listen to podcasts to learn something new. They're heavy social media users, although Edison reports that Facebook and Twitter users are declining for youth, while podcasting is rising at the same time. And they're influenced by word of mouth. Podcasts have high, or I would argue, highest engagement levels. So we're experiencing listen through rates on our podcasts of 90 to 95% of 20 to 30 minutes on a weekly or biweekly basis. So just compare that for a minute to an average YouTube video seeing about 50% watch through rate on 1 minute. So we would argue that no other marketing channel has this high of an engagement rate. And as a matter of fact, the statistics we have of 90 to 95% are slightly higher than market, but the market is doing incredibly well as well. Many other podcast producers are experiencing very, very, very high engagement rates. And similarly, there's also the perception of high engagement value. So listeners have reported that they receive high engagement value from a podcast equivalent or just slightly under checking the news, checking weather, or listening to music. So it's seen as a medium that's delivering a huge amount of value to the listener. Number four, podcasts give great ROI. So we know from talking to marketing professionals every day that many scratch their heads when it comes to measuring their content ROI. And there's a number of different ways you can do it. I mean, you can start off by simply measuring financial ROI, right? That's simple enough. It's net profit over how much you've invested times 100. However, depending on your goals, you'll want to measure the content success or the ROI from your content in other ways. For example, podcasts will have a positive impact on your brand metrics such as awareness, authority, consideration, purchase intent. We know that particularly setting up landing pages for your podcasts can assist with lead generation, site traffic, conversions, and SEO. And then there's the podcast engagement metrics themselves. You know, what are your listens like and downloads, your engagement or your listen through length, and the reviews that you're getting on your podcast. So ROI, well, traditionally seen as being financial, there's a number of ways to earn a return on your podcast. We go into great depth on our blog about this topic, so we'd encourage you to read more there if you're interested. But the concept here is to consider other types of returns in your ROI calculations. Number 5, podcasts are an intimate medium. So podcasts have thrived because they're able to deliver one thing that the internet and other mediums have not been very good at, and that is intimacy. So when we break it down, it's literally, the message is literally in your ear, right? It's like a brand whispering to their listener. It's catered to personal preference, and the listeners are mostly solo on their own time. They're also portable, right? We know that we can listen to podcasts in the car, on the bus or the subway, at the beach, walking the dog, running, at the gym. My favorite, washing the dishes, mowing the lawn, grocery shopping, working. So you can multitask while listening. As a matter of fact, BBC Audio, another interesting report, hyperlinked at the bottom, and you will obviously be getting a copy of this deck. Definitely encourage you to read this one. BBC Audio came out with Activated, and they found that in this report, 94% of listeners consume podcasts while performing other tasks, right? So they're multitasking. So this multitasking mode actually elevates engagement with the brand. So let's dive in a bit deeper. From this study, they learned that 2 processes occur in order to deliver this. Number 1, keeping the brain occupied enhances the ability for brand messages to achieve cut through. So activity means that the podcast content is being taken in through low involvement processing. So this is a much more fuel efficient process in the brain. It has a lower cognitive load. And as such, engagement with the content can last so much longer. It's one reason why you can multitask and still retain the content that you're listening to. Reason number 7, podcasts are a pull medium. So listeners subscribe to the content. They seek out the content. They have an active interest in the material that's available to them. So for example, one thing that I like looking at every day is in my podcast apps. I listen to more than one app. I love seeing the content popping up because I've subscribed to it and I'm actively waiting for it. And listeners reward podcasts with their time, right? So weekly podcast listeners, again, according to Edison Research 2020 report, which breaks it down monthly and weekly. So the weekly podcast listeners spend an average of 6.5 hours listening to podcasts every week. Podcasts are also great for internal communications. So an internal podcast versus an external podcast is a podcast produced by an organization, but it's distributed to their employees and partners privately and securely with a direct link or through the intranet. And there's obviously measurement options, which allows you to understand, well, what's the listen through rate from your employee base to the senior leadership team's podcast, for example, or the human resources podcast. And there's a number of benefits of internal podcasts, obviously. It's a great break from screen fatigue during the pandemic. Emails and intranets largely go unread, plus they're one-dimensional. They're not intimate. It's not the voice in the ear. They're delivered in a format that staff embrace on their own time. Again, they could be doing the dishes or going for a run while they're listening to this internal podcast. It's fantastic for culture building, onboarding, development. and it's delivered in that conversational style. You get to hear the voice, the tone of voice from your senior leadership team. Podcasts are a flexible medium. So there's no constraints on time. You know, our podcasts at JAR are typically 20 to 30 minutes. They can be longer. Joe Rogan, extreme examples, anywhere from 1.5 to 3 hours sometimes. So there's no constraints on time. There's no constraints on format. We will talk about the different types of format in a minute. No ad standards. There's no constraints on topics, no constraints on shelf life. You can easily go back and retroactively listen to old topics. Particularly, this works well in history. If you want to go back and listen to history podcasts, those are almost limitless in their expiry dates. And podcasts, number 10, have continued through the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, of course, JAR was, quite happy to push people into studios. But what we find now is that, well, I should say we've always recorded our guests. Many of our guests have always been remote, and so not a lot of that has changed. However, we have at JAR put much more energy into the technology that we use, and we actually came up with a proprietary recording system that works really, really well in COVID, because again, now not just the guests, but many of the hosts of our podcasts are recording from home. They really work well during the pandemic as well, because audiences still want to be entertained. They want to learn a new skill, or they want to escape, right? And from a consumption perspective, we know that the podcast volumes, the listener volumes, were down in March, I think 5%, but they came back in May to be 10% above January. So that curve continues to expand even during and post first wave COVID.
So we've talked about the benefits of branded podcasts and why brands are embracing them. You might be from an organization that is thinking about producing your own podcast. So we wanted to provide you with a little bit of information on how you can go about doing that. So you've probably heard us enough already on this topic, but it's very much about delivering value first. So you need to be super clear on who that listener is. And specifically, you want to understand, what do they need? What do they care about? And what are they also listening to? What are the things that you can be teaching that audience? How can you help them, especially now with the pandemic? There's a lot of people that are looking for work, for example. What can your brand provide them to help them prepare for the new economy, or for the next step in their career or life? And also, how can you entertain them? There's nothing that says a brand's podcast should be very serious and straight-laced. Perfect example is McDonald's ran a branded podcast a few years ago called The Sauce, which was a sort of a spoof on This American Life or cereal, but they investigated what happened to the Szechuan dipping sauce for their McNuggets, and it was fantastic. And of course, there's that brand halo effect there as well. It's really funny. Really, though, it takes the right type of brand. You need to have a point of view. You need to have some creative bravery. And again, you have to lean in and deliver as much value as possible. And one way of delivering value is in quality. High production value is going to turn into a better listening experience, and something that a listener is going to want to come back to and pull more from. You're going to want to try to find the right host. Now, we typically like to recommend that the host comes from from outside the organization, for a couple of reasons. One, they're probably going to be professional, and you'll be able to work with somebody who's seasoned and knows how to conduct an interview properly. But more so, it allows you to have a little bit more of an objective point of view on things, so that it's typically staff are quite ingrained in the brand, and it's nice to have somebody who's perhaps a little bit a few steps away, so that they can provide a little bit of a point of view. You're going to want to choose the right music. Now, you can find all sorts of needle drop possibilities, a lot of stock out there, or you can have it custom produced so that it weaves in perfectly with the show and throughout the episode. We recommend producing multiple scenes in an episode. What I mean by that is, perhaps you are interviewing somebody, but maybe you then take it to the street and incorporate a streeter element to the episode, or you go in field, when it's safe to do so from the pandemic, and you record some what we would call live action scenes, and then weave those throughout the episode. And reason for doing so is one, it just makes a really much more interesting episode, but it actually, just from the psychology of it, it actually wakes the brain up as the listener is listening. And so that engagement level that we talked about being so important, because this is a marketing medium, is that you have a higher chance of receiving a higher engagement value, because the brain is following along. We like to talk about the host of the show as being sort of the docent of the episode, kind of like somebody walking you through a museum, showing you exhibits. That host is also meant to break up the episode as well. And of course, well-crafted storytelling is paramount to a really great podcast. So how do you produce a great podcast? We talk about a 4P framework at Jar Audio, which we wanted to pass on to you, but this is something that you can produce entirely within your organization. The first P in the 4P is produce. Again, you want to think about the audience first. We suggest conducting a workshop with your team where you sit down and talk about who that audience is, get a really good understanding of the ins and outs of what, what that audience believes in, understands, where they listen to podcasts or other forms of audio. You're then going to want to produce a strategy document, which is, a bit of a roadmap for yourself and the production moving forward. You're going to want to develop a season arc, which gives you a bit of an understanding of how episodes are going to be rolled out throughout the year. It allows you to plan accordingly as well. And then the story format. What type of format are we looking at when it comes to the show itself? Is it interview style? Is it more of a documentary style where the listener is taking on a bit more of a journey, or maybe it's sort of maybe it's more of a like a sci-fi based sorry, my brain just went blank there. Maybe it's more of a style like the message that we showed earlier, which takes the listener on a bit more of a fictional direction. You're then going to want to research your guests. You want to make sure that the guests are fully understood, and that helps you write your question line for the interview. If you're conducting an interview, you want to write scripts. So the scripts will help to direct the interview. You're going to want to look for the right host. That can either be done, internally, like we talked about, or you scout and try to hire the right external host. Of course, record the episode itself. You then want to look for the right music, whether that's custom or stock. Of course, then go into sound editing, so you're editing the episodes itself, and then hosting and distribution, which I'll touch on a little bit further. So depending on the format, a 6-episode season should take roughly 1 to 2 months to produce the first 2 episodes. We like to recommend launching a show with 2 episodes. Reason being is it allows the listener to listen to 1 episode and then immediately listen to a second. But once you've launched those 2 episodes, typically you should be able to launch 1 to 2 episodes, 1 episode every 1 to 2 weeks after that. From a capacity standpoint, if you're working with an agency like ourselves, JAR has calculated that the client needs to make themselves available for about 6 days total of work over the 4 to 5 month period that a season would consist of. Second is push. Paul, did you want to take over from here?
Sure, no worries. Yeah. So the second step in the production process is push. So one of the biggest concerns we hear from brands is their assumption about how difficult podcast distribution is going to be, getting the podcast from the production itself to the listeners. And it's actually really simple. So we recommend signing up for a dependable online podcast server software to push the show and its episodes out to the podcast world. So we happen to use Omni Studio. And Omni Studio, once you upload it, go to the next slide, it actually just pushes the the podcast to the listeners and to the podcasters directly. So Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. In addition, podcast server software will give you access to analytics, listener analytics. We'll talk about that in a minute. Reviews from the listeners. It'll give you an embedded player, so you can embed it on your website. You can set up landing pages. It'll give you social links that you can share socially as part of your promotion as well. Great. And I think you were going to do poll, Roger.
Yeah. So, once you've pushed that show out to the world, we're then going to want to pull in all sorts of data. And, one of the great things about podcasting is all the data that's tied into it. So as Paul mentioned, we're able to access analytics for the show itself, as well as consumption data. From an analytics standpoint, and this is all real time, we're able to see how many downloads an episode is getting, how many subscribers we're seeing, and where perhaps, where we're perhaps losing subscribers. We're able to see the full reach. We're able to read all of the reviews, view all the demographics around the show listener. We can see the age. We can, in some cases, see the sex. We can then go into and see the geography of the episode itself, where the show is being listened. Then from a consumption standpoint, we're able to see the verified plays. So, how many times has that episode been played? The average time that the listener has listened to an episode. We can then see the retention levels. So how long through an episode have we seen people listening, which is important for us because that tells us whether maybe perhaps the episode is not as interesting as we expected, or maybe there was a guest that wasn't interesting, or perhaps there's a feature or a segment of the show that isn't interesting. We're then able to also see the starting point of where someone listens to an episode, as well as the drop-off point, and where do they skip in an episode as well. And then you're going to want to promote the episode as well. Now, big misconception is that you put a podcast out in the world and it just kind of goes viral and it all just steamrolls from there. The reality is that you do have to put some effort into the promotion of the show. Much like promoting any other form of that a broadcaster would do, the show needs a certain level of attention. We look at it from 6 main buckets. The first bucket is marketing. So this is where you're going to want to look for partnership and opportunities with media companies and social platforms to promote the show. There's all sorts of different relationships you can strike depending on the type of show you're producing and what other media channels there are out there that are tied in with the audience that you're trying to hit. Then we look at PR or earned media. This is where we create publicity materials and contact lists based on the show topic. This is where you're going to want to produce an outreach plan and timelines, just so you can keep track of who you've reached out to and what the response has been. The third bucket is what we call spotlight. Now, there's a big misconception that when your show is featured at the top of Apple Podcasts, for example, as the new and notable, that's some sort of algorithm that you've beat. That's just not true. But there is no algorithm to beat. The reality is that each of the key podcast directories have editorial staff. So there are real people on the other end of the web who are making those decisions to feature certain podcasts up there. And because they're real people, you can really pitch them. So you're able to reach out to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, other directories, and make a pitch for why your podcast should be featured. Now, it could be featured because it's getting a lot of downloads. It could be featured though because it's a really cool or really timely topic. Recently, we saw a lot of Black Lives Matter podcasts being featured. I'm sure as we lead up to the U.S. elections, you're going to see a lot of political ones. So again, it just really depends on the time, what's going on in the world, but also the time of year. And make your best argument for why you should be featured. The third bucket is cross promotion. Now, the best listeners for your podcast are going to be other podcast listeners. They're sort of the low-hanging fruit. And so one of the ways to do that is to reach out to similar type podcasts or podcasts that you think your listeners are also listening to, and try to make a deal. See if they're willing to perhaps be interviewed on your show in exchange for the host of your show being interviewed on theirs. The other thing to do is swap content. Maybe you run one of their episodes as a special bonus episode in your feed in exchange for them running an episode of yours. You know, it's really really fun in this community to have those sorts of discussions, and most people are quite open to it. And then, of course, there's the paid opportunities. You know, this is where you're, you know, buying strategically placed advertising in the right channels. Could be social, but we would recommend the more pertinent channel is some of the other podcast directories. And the whole idea is to increase exposure for the show. And then our final category is kind of what we call plus more. And this is where you really need to think about your brand and what's the unfair advantage you have as a brand. Do you have an amazing newsletter list that you can send out promotions for the podcast to? Or if you're a nonprofit organization, do you have like a huge volunteer group that you're able to reach out to and help disseminate the show? If you're an online, if you're a service and software, do you have a website that everybody goes to that you can promote the show at the top of? You really need to just think hard about what you're able to leverage. A couple things additionally, you don't want to forget the design of your podcast ecosystem. There are some moving parts and pieces that go into that ecosystem, including the artwork for the show. You want something to send the listener to. That could be a landing page or maybe a microsite to provide more information on an episode. Or maybe you want to be capturing leads, or whatever the objectives of the show is. You want to think about social content. What is the language and look and feel of that social content? I'm a big brand guy, so I like everything to kind of look and feel the same and tight when it comes to the brand look and feel of the show itself. And then social links. You want to think about what your strategy is for that, so whether you're tagging them. There's also certain links or certain programs that we recommend, one of them being Chartable, which has a program called Smart Links, which we use to share throughout any social activation that we're doing with our shows. The reason being is that if somebody clicks on one of those smart links, it learns what the best way to serve up the podcast is by sending that podcast to the podcast directory of choice that you like to use. And so, in my case, if I click on a link to one of the podcasts, it opens up into Apple Podcasts for me. It might be that it opens up into Overcast for somebody or Castbox for somebody else. This is an idea of kind of what some of the artwork looks like. You want something very clean and simple, easy to recognize. But also there's a lot of really creative ways of incorporating, it could be illustration, it could be video, different design elements into the show. This is an example of a landing page for Hackable. And then there's some other considerations when it comes to podcast promotion. Now, I mentioned podcast advertising. Of course, you can advertise your show on a podcast. If you go to do that, there are a few different options you need to consider. The first is whether the advertisement that you're purchasing is baked in or is it dynamically inserted. When it's baked in, it literally lives within the audio file that's being downloaded to people's devices, and therefore, for lack of a better term, it kind of lives in history and forever in that episode. One of the downsides of that is that you can't really rely on your advertisements to be timely, because you're sort of incorporating it into the audio. It's living there forever. In these cases, the ad though is typically read by the host, so they are able to inject some personality into the promotion, which has a lot of benefit to podcast listeners and the brands that are advertising to them. The other way, and I'd say the sort of the newest way, is through dynamic ad insertion. And this is where podcasts are selling the donut space within their episode. And as an advertiser, you're able to choose the demographics and even geography of who you want to target. And then your ads are being inserted into a number of different podcasts dynamically. Great thing about that is just the flexibility of being able to target certain people and target your message, refresh the creative based on time of year or what sort of promotion or offer you have. And also we typically see them as being a little less cost per CPM when it comes to the price of them. So hopefully we provide you with a ton of value and understanding of the branded podcast world and the podcast world. We want to share a little bit more about us as Jar Audio. I mentioned that Jar Audio produces podcasts for brands. Really we're a creative studio that uses podcasts and other long-form audio to make meaningful connections between people and brands. From a leadership team standpoint, we have an impeccable amount of experience building brands, producing engaging digital content, and telling compelling stories. But we're backed up by an incredible team of writers, recordists, sound engineers, and audience growth strategists that know how to hold your attention, shake you to your core, and make you feel the feels. A lot of our team comes to the table with journalism experience, and so everything we do has journalistic integrity, and then we blend our audio expertise in there to create a real powerful punch. From a full service standpoint, we are capable of doing absolutely everything that we've mentioned in the presentation today. Everything from strategy all the way down to custom music, and then hosting and distributing the show all the way down to producing the advertisements that we just talked about, receiving and dissecting the analytics. Really, we just love doing creative, collaborative projects that are fun. And we've done that for some really great brands. I mentioned earlier, Expedia, Cineplex, Lululemon, but also Sage Natural Wellness, Port of Vancouver. Really, really exciting projects are in the hopper as well that we're excited to bring out to the world soon.
Yeah, so thanks, Roger. First of all, just to finish up in terms of moving forward, even if you don't want to deal with JAR, we want to be there as a resource for the industry. We are committed to this industry. And so going forward, if you do have questions, if you're producing your own podcast and you just wanted a sounding board for what you're up to, then please reach out. That being said, we're also a full service agency and our services are scalable. Right. So we can be full service, but we can also scale down if you have wanted to work with some professionals and have some in-house capabilities of your own. From a pricing perspective, we offer a bespoke service. And so what that simply means is that all of our projects will be different, but generally speaking, if you wanted to have a lens on pricing in this industry, we charge roughly $400 a delivered minute. And so if you were to multiply a typical season of 6 episodes times the average 20 minutes times $400, that works out to about $48,000 or about $8,000 an episode. So that should just give you some budget guidance, I guess you could say. It can scale up or down depending on the work that we're doing. And typically it does take about 4 to 5 months sometimes to complete production and season release on the first 6 episodes. A best next step, if you're interested, again, if you want to just use this as a sounding board, happy to talk to you. But if you wanted to talk in more detail about working together, we usually start with a 30-minute consultation with myself. And Roger, if you click one more time, they can see my contact information, my cell. If you want to book a chat, my calendar is right there. Or if you want to email me, I'm paul@jaraudio.com.
Before we go, I wanted to let you know that we have a really great offer for everyone, and this will be provided in the details that Zoom will be sending out to you tomorrow. We're going to give you access to the vital podcast statistics that all brands should learn about. This is what we think to be the web's most comprehensive grouping of all the important statistics and facts that you need to know. Perhaps to sell the idea of producing a podcast through your organization or just for your knowledge yourself. So you'll see a link to that in the deck that you'll have access to tomorrow. I really encourage you to check that out. There's a lot of really great information, and we're updating it. We're updating it all the time. Before we go, did anybody have any questions? It doesn't appear that anybody does, but I just wanted to give you a couple seconds to perhaps ask them in the Q&A box if you did. No, doesn't look like you do. That's okay. With that, though, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck and happy podcasting.
Thanks everyone for your time. Look forward to talking to you in the future.